gave a talk at our law school in Seattle a while ago, and I sat in the back of the room before I was introduced, and I noticed that 110 law students had their laptops open to 110 different screens while they were listening to their professor talk. We're going to need those laptops in 1 hour to do a simulation about Syria. But until then, we're going to shut them, put them into the off position. Okay, this is going to be probably more information than you want. But it, I think, could be used, the reason I put the case of Syria is that you can use the Syrian situation as a case study in a way to look at all the conflicts around the world that have created all the refugees around the world, in many cases the cause of those refugees. And so sit back a little bit and bear with me, because understanding the political and historical and colonial context of the refugee crisis is absolutely critical. Things didn't start in Syria on March 15th of 2003 when the US invaded Iraq, or on 9/11 when the planes took down the World Trade Center. Things didn't start then. Things started in some cases thousands of years ago in this part of the world. And so one thing I always mention when I talk about the Middle East to people, particularly in America, is it reminds me of the early days of Facebook. And that in the early days of Facebook, you just had 3 options for designating your social status: married, single, and it's complicated. Yeah? Everything about the Middle East is complicated. Everything. And if you ever hear anybody sort of make a pronouncement about it, even if that's me, be really skeptical of that, because there is nuance that we don't fully understand, no matter how much and how long we study the region. So I have this idea that, particularly for young people, when they see the headlines and they see the horrific news out of the Middle East, that it sort of strikes them as being context-free. So I think that we as educators have a kind of an obligation to fill in the blanks so that it isn't just the headlines that they get, but the underlying stories in the article that we may not always read. As somebody once said, if the only thing you knew about airplanes came from the headlines, you would think they all crashed. Yeah? So build geographic awareness, build political awareness, build interactivity of the world's people awareness with our students. Teach them, geography. I had a pointer. Teach them geography. We're going to zero in on this real crossroads, all the way at the end of the Silk Road and into the rest of the world through the Mediterranean. Syria has been at the hub of really the world's civilization for 5 or 6 or 7,000 years. In the more recent period, the Ottoman Empire that was centered in Istanbul, Constantinople, in what is now Turkey, controlled much of the Muslim world back in the day before the First World War, and Syria is right there. But during the First World War, it turns out that in trying to defeat the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans and the Ottomans, the Western powers entered into an agreement with the Bedouin of Arabia and tried to get them to revolt against their Turkish Ottoman masters And we know this story, of course, through the great tales of Lawrence of Arabia, a British intelligence officer who is seconded to the Prince of Mecca, and then he starts to train fighters to blow up their fellow Muslims and fight the Ottomans so that the Arabs could have their own homeland. Well, that's what the Western powers told the Arabs, but all the while we were telling them that, we were at the same time making a secret agreement that was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. A British lord, it turns out, a French diplomat, and they decided that what we're really going to do is carve up the Middle East to the Ottoman Empire and give half of it to the British and half of it to the French, and none of it to the Arabs, whom we talked into fighting the Ottomans. And so at the end of the First World War, if you want to understand the Middle East, you have to understand the First World War and how the successful powers divvied up this part of the world. The British took all of what is in this, whatever color, what is that? Cinnamon? Salmon. That's cinnamon, and this is cinnamon. And they took all of that area, parts of Palestine, Iraq, all the Gulf Coast, and the French took all of Syria, part of southern Turkey, all of Lebanon, and into the eastern part. And they simply controlled it and did so for quite a few years. But one of the ways they did it was to find a small sect of people from a very small tribe on the western coast of Syria called the Alawites. And the Alawites were about 10% of the Syrian population. And if that name sounds familiar, that's the tribe of Hafez al-Assad, the father, and Bashar al-Assad, the son, who is now in control of Syria. They decided that they would privilege this small sect over on the coast and use them as their sort of representatives of the French Empire in Syria that would do our bidding. The Belgians did the same thing in Central Africa with different tribes, and it eventually led to tremendous grief. Well, by 1946, yeah.
Is there not a Sunni Shia element to that?
Yes, yes. And it's complicated. It's even more complicated than that, because while many people, including the Alawites, consider themselves Muslims and consider themselves a subset of Shia Islam, of Shiites, very few Muslims outside of the Alawite tribe think that. So they got to the point in Syria within the last 40 or 50 years when Hafez al-Assad declared that Alawites were Muslims and that there wasn't going to be any discussion anymore about it. But not only is there a Sunni Shia split in Syria, and we're going to talk about that, but there is a question about whether or not the ruling class are Muslims at all. Yeah, it's complicated. I wanted to just keep maps in your minds to think about the orientation of Iraq here, Syria there, the Mediterranean coast here, Israel and Palestine here, Jordan, Lebanon, Damascus way down here, Aleppo, the largest city in Syria that we're going to talk about that is in the news so much today, and Raqqa, which is the capital of the self-styled Islamic State. So, here, sit back, because you're about to get more information than you want. As I mentioned, Syria is part of the French Mandate. And after a while, they get tired of being under the French, and as many, many countries in the post-Second World War period, they start to mobilize for their own independence from the colonial powers, and they were granted independence by France just after the war. But their attempt at democracy didn't last very long, influenced by Nasser in Egypt, and then a group of thugs, almost all from the Alawite tribe, who were linked through this political party also with Saddam Hussein, another minority leader of a country, and they staged a coup d'etat throughout the ruling party and took over. And that's when Hafez al-Assad, the father, took control and led a very brutal regime that brooked no dissent and no criticism from anybody. At one point in Hamma, which is right here, a group of people decided they'd had enough of Syrians, the government's oppression, and they rose up. And what Hafez al-Assad did was he got a whole lot of nerve gas and dropped it on the village. 40,000 people in that town were killed. His son takes power in 2000. Bashar al-Assad trained as an ophthalmologist in Britain, and people had high hopes that when he arrived on the scene, that the old regime of the Alawites would somehow become modernized and more democratic. And as we've all seen in the last 16 years, that did not happen. Speaks to your Sunni Shia question. The majority of Muslims in Syria are in fact Sunni, and the majority of Muslims in the world are in fact Sunni. Probably 85% of all Muslims would put themselves into that branch of Islam. 15% in the Shiite. And again, a very small minority of Alawites who consider themselves Shiites are in control. Late in 2010, in Tunisia, the Arab Spring begins, and people again have had it up to here with authoritarian regimes that are treating their people badly, where there is no civil society, there is a military government in almost all of these countries, and they're sick and tired of it. And they start to rise up in almost all countries, initially peacefully. In Tunisia, it seemed to have actually worked, where there is one tenuously holding on to its life, democratic government in control in Tunis. But that's the only place in the Arab world where the Arab Spring bubbled up that does in fact have a democratic government. In Daraa, a group of school children decided that they'd had enough from the government for a wide variety of reasons, and they were brutally crushed by police and army forces. Before the war started and that was the beginning of the war in 2011 in Syria. Before the war started, there were 23 million people living in this country, and since the war started, estimates vary, but the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights that operates out of London thinks this number of 300,000 is very low compared to the real number of people that have been killed in Syria. More than 4 million people of that population has left. Let's call that 20% of the total. And that means, think about it, if 20% of the room today got up and left and we never saw them again, that's a huge chunk. But even a larger group of people have been internally displaced, no longer living in their towns and villages, but have moved somewhere else within the country. That means that more than half of the country has been displaced. Then it gets really complicated because you've got ISIS, the Islamic State, that is trying to establish its caliphate in Raqqa, and we can talk about that if we have time. ISIS is trying to overthrow, ISIS, which is Sunni, trying to overthrow Hafiz al-Assad, which is a Shiite government. At the same time, the US and the Kurds up in the north in Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. At the end of the First World War, when we drew the boundaries, we've got Turkey there, we've got Iran here, we've got Iraq here, and we've got Syria here. This is Kurdistan. And it happens that they didn't care that that was Kurdistan, because why would we draw the boundaries where they want it, where there was a more or less homogenous group of people? We're going to give this to Turkey, and this to Syria, and this to Iran, and this to Iraq. And these artificial borders that we talked about earlier this morning are plaguing this whole process. All grew out of that Sykes-Picot agreement. And not just there, and it gets worse. I love this. I took a page from your book. Just throw it away. So in 1920, during this process, there was a group of Shiites down here, and a group of Sunnis right here, and a group of Kurds right here. And the colonial secretary in 1920 said, I have an idea. Let's call this, that's a bad one, throw it. Let's call this one Iraq, and create a new country. And then he wrote in his letters, they'll be so busy squabbling amongst themselves that they will be of no bother to the empire. That colonial secretary was Winston Churchill. You know, you reap what you sow. But we put a country together so that they would fight with each other. Just amazing.
Can I ask a geographic area question?
Yeah.
How does Syria compare to, say, Texas? Give me something to go on here.
It's about the same shape, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
No, I'm trying to.
no, just joking. Yeah, I don't really have a good conception for how big Texas
When
is.
you look at the Peters projection
Yeah.
in Africa and stuff, it's like.
Yeah, I would say that Syria is about the same size as France.
Okay.
I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
Spain, maybe. A little bit smaller.
Because this is political, not.
These are all political boundaries. That's right. So then the superpowers get involved, and things get even more complicated. You've got an answer. I love it, David. Go.
Texas is 268,000 square miles, and Syria is 71,000.
So it's 1/3. It's 1/3 as big as Texas. Yeah. Yeah. That's it's good that I know that now. Next time I get that, it's 71,000 miles. So the superpowers get involved because they want to control this critical hub part of the world. Yes?
Sorry, other Google, but it's equivalent to the state of Washington.
Huh? I'm going to use that one too. Yeah. So even though you two have violated the no screens agreement, I'm going to let you go because they were so good. So the superpowers get involved. So the reason that, and we'll talk about this, the reason that this is complicated is that there is a civil war going on with all kinds of rebel groups trying to throw out the government. There is a Cold War going on with Russia and the United States and Iran and Saudi backing different factions who are fighting. And there's a holy war going on, all in this place that is no bigger than the state of Washington. Yeah? But when you think about the complexity of those three levels of conflict, it gives you an appreciation for the intractable nature of this conflict and why people are fleeing for their lives. Le Monde has done a wonderful series on this, and you can Google it and get all of the maps where they sort of identify who is where. And so I put that up here, and I can send these slides to you guys too, because it starts to be really clear about what's going on in which of those wars, civil, holy, and cold. This map is a little deceptive because the green part are where the Sunnis live, and the purple part, the lavender part, is where the Shiites live. But the gray part is not that it's not Sunni, it's that it's nobody, right? Because there's nobody living out in the empty quarter right there. This is the country of Oman, where I lived for 6 years. And I lived right here for about a year and a half, and there's absolutely nothing out there. But we'll talk about that later. But one of the curious factors, even though there's a preponderance of Muslims in the world are Sunni and a very small minority are Shia, in this critical part of the world, the balance is roughly 50-50. So they actually have fellow religionists within that sect of Islam to support them in all kinds of different countries around the region. Even in Saudi Arabia, there's a good, strong Shiite population. Sometimes I'm asked, well, if they're all Muslims, why do the Sunnis and Shiites fight each other? And I scratch my head and I think, well, if they're all Christians, why? Yeah. So this is an important part of the message, is if you're a refugee, in a half an hour, you're all going to have a chance to be a refugee. And that's when we're going to need your connectivity to the internet. You have to make a whole series of calculations. And the dangers of not fleeing include what? Help me with your hands. Yeah. Dying, yep. Starving. Injury. Rape. Imprisonment. I mean, this is a pretty bleak menu that we're putting together. Yeah. Torture.
The pain of watching your children die.
Yep.
Human shield.
Being forced to be a human shield. Yep.
Enslavement.
Enslavement. So you're looking at a pretty hopeless situation if those are your options. But then, if you do flee a city like Aleppo looks like this now. Yeah, did we have an earlier photograph that looked like this? Of Dresden in Germany after the Second World War? All of those things that you mentioned, yeah.
Parts of Aleppo look like that.
Aha, good.
The western part of Aleppo does not look like that.
This is such a good point. And how did she know that my next slide was of Aleppo and the east and the west? So God, I'm bad with colors. All guys are bad with colors. Cranberry? Why don't they just use primary colors? So all of the cranberry areas are under the control of the Assad government. And as Michelle mentions, it's this part, the lime lifesaver part, that is under the control of rebel parts of the government, and not against the government. And the folks in the green are being continuously bombarded by the Assad government with particularly awful, I mean, all munitions are bad, to my mind, but barrel bombs are particularly bad. They are completely indiscriminate in whom they kill. And they've been dropping them now for 4 years on parts of Aleppo to try to break the back of the rebellion against Assad. For a while there, it looked like it was about a wash, a standoff, and then the Russians get in the game and start helping Assad to defeat any of the rebel forces. But Aleppo, you guys, you probably all know this from your history books, but right here, the citadel in Aleppo was this one, the current one, was built 1,000 years ago. There have been continuously inhabited activities of human beings in this area since probably 6,000 BC. It may be the oldest inhabited city in the world, and it is being reduced to rubble. This is a map from that International Organization for Migration that looks at the 3 main refugee routes, and this is going to be significant to you in a half an hour because you're going to be given some choices about if you do exercise, because of all those bleak things that we foresaw might happen if you stay in Aleppo. If you do exercise your right to flee and seek asylum somewhere else, you're going to have to decide how to do it. What does this map remind you of? The out of Africa map. Yeah, the routes are pretty similar to how our own ancestors left Africa and went into the rest of the world. These are the images we see now with tens of thousands of people making the journey, hopefully towards safety. We talked about the dangers of not fleeing. What are the dangers of fleeing?
Similar.
What are your hands? Where are your hands? You're not sitting on your, yeah.
Loss of culture.
Loss of culture. Yeah.
Yeah.
Death.
Poverty.
Poverty.
Alienation.
Alienation. Yeah.
Exploitation by the people with you.
Yeah, yeah. The whole issue of smugglers, human smugglers, and human traffickers comes to play. Yeah.
Never being able to go back.
Yeah, complete separation. I don't think my great-grandfather ever went back to Norway, but he could have if he had ever figured out how to get enough money to do that. But you're absolutely right. These people are cut off forever. And it isn't just from their culture, but from their kids, their parents, their brothers, their sisters. Catherine?
I was going to say, being stuck in a refugee camp for 17 years.
Yeah, yeah. And that's
Raising
not,
your family there.
and that's not what you think of. You think of using your smartphone, you think of your uncle in Toledo, Ohio. Yeah, I'm going to get there and work in his shop, and we're going to start to build a new life. But the journey to get there is so fraught. It gets worse, folks. It gets worse, folks. Yeah.
What's interesting is these people probably, many of them probably know some of this, which takes you back to your number 1 point, the dangers of not fleeing. They're saying, I would rather take a risk of being 17 years in that refugee camp
And alive.
and alive
Yep.
than having bombs, barrel bombs.
Yep, yep. So think of that as a calculation as we try to, this morning I tried to figure out whether to wear this tie or my Jerry Garcia tie. I mean, that was the decision I tried to make this morning. They're making that calculation.
How bad must it be then to push them?
Yeah, yeah. And I'd rather, as one refugee said, I'd rather die, I'd rather drown quickly than die slowly, where I am now. Oh, we've got extra time. What we're going to do is we're going to invite you all, stretch your legs a little bit, and then we're going to go through a simulation. But before we do that, and before I introduce it, and before I invite you to open up your laptops or your tablets or your smartphones, what kinds of questions do you have about Syria or refugees in general, about the things we've talked about? Even observations, yeah.
Sorry to take you back to the previous map of Aleppo, but you had a brown color that was in there. Do you recall what that brown color signified? You had the pro-government, the anti-government. Was that just a mixture zone, or was that
Military installations.
brown? But in the old Citadel, you got a couple of browns that are kind of in the middle.
Yeah, you know, you're absolutely right.
Is that maybe an unknown?
I really don't know the answer to that.
Either side controls that?
Yeah, maybe maybe it's a neutral zone. Maybe it's,
They're all on the periphery, right on the border.
yeah. It's not military bases because those are pretty clearly delineated. Yeah, I don't know. I'll find out. Yeah.
And what's the shape on Maksud? Why is that yellow?
That's a neighborhood that for some reason is in yellow, named after a prominent Muslim cleric, and I don't know why it's yellow.
Maybe he's neutral?
Maybe neutral. It's hard to be neutral in that part of the world.
Self-proclaimed.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
What is the United States involvement?
A couple nights ago, there's a wonderful PRI radio program called To the Point. And they look at different, a commentator, the moderator is named Warren Alney. Maybe you've heard him on NPR. They had a panel discussion asking that very same question. And so what you might do is Google up To the Point and go to the one that was 2 or 3 days ago, what to do about Syria. And all the people they interviewed were either government officials, former government officials, or academics who were looking at it. And at the end of the discussion, they sort of all throw up their hands and they say, whatever we do is not going to be, probably not going to be successful, and might be just the opposite. And one of the images that they used was making pizza without enough flour on your hands and making the dough, and it all sticks to you instead of forming into a nice round ball of dough. And so it's got the potential for having longer term impacts because of our involvement. There is a wonderful, I think it's on your reading list, which we're going to look at. It's not on your reading list, but I'll send it to you. There's a wonderful website called Agence Globale, and it's a place where commentators from around the world are thinking almost exclusively about the Middle East. And the guy who writes brilliantly, a Palestinian Jordanian, works in Lebanon now, in Beirut, but a Christian commentator is named Rami Khouri. And if you just Google this at Agence Globale, you'll find some absolutely insightful commentary on what the real roots of the problem are. And he posits that there are 4 of them. One of them, he goes back and looks at colonial interference with separating some people, the Kurds, all being separated, and forcing together other people, the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Kurds in Iraq, as a historical reason why things are difficult. He then looks at the continuing involvement of the superpowers in the region with governments propping up dictators in almost all cases, Mubarak in Egypt, the Shah of Iran, the Saudi royal family are getting tremendous support, or did get tremendous support from outside forces. So that contributed to the mess. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine, particularly over the settlements issues, with Israel continuing to build settlements in violation of UN Resolution 242 and a whole bunch of others. And finally, he says that the reason why things are such a mess there is not just because of the outside involvement and the conflict in Israel, but because the Arabs themselves have done such an awful job of ruling themselves. Instead of civil society and schools and equitable distribution of wealth, they have these police states that are run by oligarchies who have all the resources and all the power. So that he says those four pillars are what is really making this part of the world so complicated. But virtually anything Rami Khouri writes is worth reading. Absolutely brilliant.
Wouldn't some of these oligarchies have been in, together with corporations, international corporations for the oil there, and that's why also the colonial superpowers, neo-colonialism, remain? They hold up these puppet governments too, a lot of them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in 1935, President Roosevelt met with the Saudi king, then Abdulaziz ibn Saud, on a ship in the Red Sea. And according to historical records, the Saudi king brought all his wives, and he brought 250 goats, and he brought a camel or two, and they put them all on board ship. And Roosevelt and he sat on the deck of the ship and historically reached out and shook each other's hands and said to each other, I will provide you forever with security if you provide me forever with oil. So we made a deal to prop up, essentially, a despotic regime that we're still propping up, in return for that life-giving fluid that our industry and economy seems to have needed. That kind of a deal was made in Iran with the Shah, and we have been extracting oil from that region for 60, 70, 80 years. But you're absolutely right. There is a corporate interest in having someone who controls the spigot. May I borrow your spigot? If I can just say, Gail, I really want to drink your oil here, and could you give it to me, and I'll make life really good for you. What do you say?
Say sure.
Sure. Now,
What does the currency have to do?
yeah. Oh. Now, if Gail has to turn to every one of you in the room and get your consensus on whether or not I have access to that oil, how is that going to be as quick a process? No. Is it going to be as clean a process? No. It's going to be maybe an unsuccessful process. Maybe they decide, no, we don't want to give it to you. We want to give it to Vladimir Putin over here because he also wants something from us. And so we would much rather, and all superpowers have done this, we would much rather deal with an autocrat at the spigot than a democracy. But how does that run counter to our founding principles, our basic belief that in self-determination, that people should decide on their own what to do with their resources collectively? Yeah.
So we talk a lot about what's the U.S. doing. We know what Russia's doing. What about the other Arab states? They have sat back to some extent. They're taking some refugees, not as many as they potentially could. What's the latest status on their involvement? It's a crisis right in there.
Yeah. The Arab states, particularly the oil rich Arab states, Saudi, Qatar, the Emirates, Bahrain to a lesser extent, and Kuwait, have been roundly criticized for not admitting people. They have at the same, and that's a valid criticism. They've also provided billions of dollars in refugee support for those camps in Jordan and in Iran and in Turkey and in Lebanon. So they're paying to almost not participate. All of those governments are extremely paranoid, right? And if they think that there's going to be an influx of people who might not be Sunni, who might not be royalists, who might come in with ideas like democracy, women's rights, women's driving rights. We really don't want our kingdom to be polluted by our brother and sister Arabs. But we feel bad about it, and Islam says to us we need to be providing for our all brothers, whether in the faith or in humanity, so they give money. But they also are playing a more complicated game, particularly the Saudis, because they want to be the cornerstone of a stable Middle East that has a Sunni focus. The Iranians want to be the cornerstone of a Middle East that has a Shiite focus. And the two of those are sort of mini superpowers that are vying for control, particularly around the Gulf on either side where all that oil is. Yeah.
So in connection with that, what effect, if any, do you think that the media, American media, particularly those pictures of those two children,
Yeah.
one that Hillary Clinton mentioned in one of the debates about the little boy on the ambulance with the bloody head?
Yeah, that was in Aleppo, by the way. Yeah.
And the other one was the refugee, I think he was Syrian.
Elan Kurdi, yeah. He was Kurdish, in fact, but from Iraq, but died, yeah.
I mean, these were around the world. These were viral. What effect, if any, do you think that this will have on American foreign policy vis-a-vis what's going on with refugees?
I would like to think there was a good option for American foreign policy as written by the government. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the good things that we do is we accept a large number of refugees each year. And one of the things we'll talk more about is how many is enough and how many is too many. We're going to do that before, probably just after lunch. But I'm of the generation that when the Soviet Union and the United States were at loggerheads and warheads at each other, a whole bunch of us decided that there were better ways to communicate and interact with the Russians rather than through our governments. And so I'm hoping that one element of our foreign policy will not be what our government does, but what we do. And I think there are a million different ways of being active as human beings and working toward resolution and support of all the people that are fleeing those conflicts. And those conflicts are way beyond their control, and they're probably beyond our control. But there is something we can do. Arizona had, even though the governor has said no Syrian refugees, blessedly, the governor doesn't control U.S. immigration policy. 29 governors in the United States said no Syrians. Well, Arizona settled 800 Syrians last year. And so there are, and there will be more coming. And the governor doesn't have a way to stop that process. But all of us can get involved, and we're going to talk about this at the end of the day, on an individual basis about what we can do to facilitate that process. There isn't much we can do. Anais Nin, I saw her when I was in college, just before she died. It was during the Vietnam War, and she said, you know, there isn't much I can do about the bombing in Cambodia, but I can go next door and talk to my neighbor, take her a plate of cookies and a cup of coffee, and talk about how she's going to vote next time. And I have a great deal of faith in that process on a very individual level. I was with a bunch of former Peace Corps volunteers who went to the Soviet Union and tried to do a whole bunch of people-to-people things way back when both my government and the Soviet government didn't like me doing it. Yeah? But we had the magic secret strategy. We took our 8-month-old daughter with us when we went to the Soviet Union in the 80s. And when they refused to let our group through the border because we were suspect, someone said, "Bring up the baby." And so I'm at the back of the line and I'm handing little Sophie up through this group of 15 or 20 Americans, and they pass her through the little box where the guy with the stamp was going to let us in or not, and he takes my daughter through into the little box and holds her like this, and without looking at the passports, just stamps them all. Yeah? And I then come up at that last, and I want my daughter back. Yeah, and so I'm sort of saying, and he's saying, "Nuh-uh, I'm keeping her." And we had a nice little discussion, but you can, kids, I mean, these 50% of these refugees are kids. They will melt your heart, just as they melted that Soviet immigration official. Seeing that those photographs is what mobilized a lot of people around the United States to get more involved, and in all of Europe. One of the heartening things you see in Europe are people who are down at the docks in Lampedusa and in Greece and in Spain with welcome signs. Yeah? While the governments and their political parties might be saying, "Stay away, we think you're terrorists," people are really getting involved on a human level, and I think that's something we can do in a much greater way. Yeah.
Maybe tying in the corporate issue with some of these others, it's maybe to use your phrase, it's complicated. Roosevelt, when he makes that agreement, he's thinking Great Depression, World War II, those are the things he's got in mind. So whether it's a good or bad decision, we have to make sure we understand the context. Working with Iran and with oil, we're thinking of the Cold War. Today, we've got all these issues. Where does this fit into the issues? I'm not suggesting this isn't a big issue, but I can understand why our government might be distracted by China or Russia or some of these other ones, because they feel like they're the ones that are hitting me or pointing a gun at me. Well, this is a gash on my finger. Yeah, a gash is pretty serious, but if somebody's pointing a gun at me, I'll probably pay attention to the gun first.
It's a good point.
For better or for worse.
Those are all good points.
Got to remember the context.
Yeah, context is pretty much everything. And I think that particularly if we hadn't invaded Iraq and we hadn't invaded Afghanistan and occupied those two countries, that we'd probably be acting in a different way in Syria. If we hadn't bombed and killed Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and left chaos behind, we would probably be acting in a different way in Syria, because what's going on there is, as you've all described, is horrifying. It's just inhuman. But what the world is left to do is get involved or not get involved. In either case, it's a losing proposition. What do you do then? Okay, so you are now going to deploy your screens, yeah, with permission. If you don't have access to a screen, go and sit next to somebody who does. Okay, and type into your search engine Syrian Journey and BBC, and you should get this website.
Is it all together?
You could just Google, yeah. In Google, go to Syrian Journey and BBC and see if it takes you to a page that looks like what's on the screen. Okay, don't go ahead and start yet, but let's just, what you're going to be faced with as you move through this is 6 or 7 different steps and sets of decisions that you're going to need to make as you try to flee a place where you fear persecution. And you will be asked a series of questions, and depending on how you answer them, you will be taken to a different screen. So you are now the refugee, and go ahead and take a few minutes and move through this simulation as the refugee. And if you have an outcome that you don't like, start over and then make different decisions? Give you about 5 minutes. Okay. Now it's your opportunity to share your impressions, your experience, the challenges you faced, or the successes you had with the group. Don't be shy. Yeah.
The first time I went through, Turkey, decided not to pay the guy. Actually ended up okay till I got to the point where this lady and her child are off the boat, and I have to decide to run in the woods or rescue them. I chose to rescue them and got caught. I did it again and didn't rescue her and got through. So, yeah.
How did you feel about that?
Bad, yet I got through. So when I went through I did the second thing and went through a different route and decided not to help anybody, and I drowned anyway. So,
Other impressions? Yeah.
So I also did it twice, and I did the exact same pathway with the exception of one variable the second time. And the second time I made it to Italy.
What was the variable?
The variable was to even to disobey the smuggler and go out in the community and buy the life jacket. And that was the thing that allowed me to get to Italy, was having the life jacket.
Other observations? What was your experience?
We tried one male and one female, and they were, but I think that with the male, we took more risks, just being the fact that we were male, but we still ended up in a refugee camp. But we had our families. Both ended up in refugee camps, and we ended up with our families. So I think family was a critical thing of importance, but we all were alive, but in refugee camps. But we took more risks as males.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think it's important to realize that, like you said, more than half of these refugees are children. So I think in the mindset of maybe you and your spouse going through this and what risks you would take versus these are probably parents of, small children to young adults. So you're going to take different risks as a parent, as a family unit versus maybe, your children are grown and you're just worried about you, or you're worried about you and your spouse. So I, as a parent of young children right now, I'm prioritizing, and I don't judge me, but I didn't save the woman and her child because I thought about my kids need me. So we ran into, I'm totally embarrassed right now that I didn't save her, but I was thinking about my own family. If I was in that situation, I had small children, how are they going to survive if I don't take them out of the danger? I did the same thing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just made I was in the same place, and it was save this woman and her daughter, or take care of me and my husband and daughter. And same thing, the survival kicks in. It's like, no, let's take care of us, and then have to live with the guilt.
Yes.
But then I did it the other way, and if you had tried to save her, your family ends up in Greece, and you end up in the refugee camp in Turkey.
For 17 years, yeah.
That made me very emotional trying to make that decision.
Yep.
I had a very, very hard time.
Yeah, no, this is a hard simulation to do, and if you ever use it with students, you might try to trigger warning is the wrong word, but recognize that you're going to be faced with some very difficult decisions. And what other impressions did you guys have?
I wondered if I would feel differently about the decisions if I had a belief in fate or a belief in God's will, no matter what. And so what I'm saying is my American decision-making is shaped by my values, which is save the woman and the child. But I think living with the guilt is something an American would do. I'm not sure my grandparents felt that way when they got out of it.
When you learn Arabic, you learn the past tense and the present tense, And when you learn the future tense of verbs, they always add the word inshallah, God willing. And so you can't say, I will see you after lunch, without saying inshallah in Arabic. And so it really speaks, particularly for the Syrian refugees and many from Muslim majority countries, they really do have this sense. Kulli shay maktub, they say in Arabic. Everything is written. And that whether it is written that you go down or you survive or you're separated or you're together, a lot of people have a sense that that's both fate and faith. Faith, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just had the impression that it's expensive. And the people that are doing this are the ones that have some money. So does that mean the people who are still there are the ones that just have no means to even try to escape?
Or in many cases, they've pooled the resources in the extended family. Remember, in that part of the world, family is everything. And as important as family is, tribe is also important because you have an affiliation and a loyalty there, but you also can get resources from the tribe. And in many cases, particularly of West and East African men that you see on ships landing in Italy or Greece, and you wonder, these aren't Syrians or Afghans, these are young men that may be economic migrants, but they're coming from places where the family has said, you're the youngest, you're the strongest, you're male, and we're going to risk sending you so that you can have a better chance of making it, and then either through remittances help support us or bring us to Britain or wherever you end up. Yeah.
I just heard an interesting statistic at another session that 90% of the refugees right in that region are not even in the camps. Like they're trying to live in just the communities, and then worldwide it's like 30%. Have you heard that? Like 30% live in camps worldwide, and 70 are living outside of the camps.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I think that's probably really true in the lands around Syria, where you've got the Turkish contingent and the Lebanese and the Jordanian and the Iraqi and the Iranian. Many of those are going into communities where they have relatives or connections in some way and not living in camps, because a lot of times the camps, and I don't know that anybody mentioned this, but they can be the least secure places outside of the country that's being bombed. And so there's all kinds of heartache and grief that you can experience in one of those camps. Okay, yeah.
Just a question. We call this the Great Migration. Have there been similar movements in history this big and bigger?
Yeah. For 400 years, Europe populated the planet. Huge numbers of people left Europe. And there have been some commentators that are saying, and now the planet is coming back to Europe, and that this is sort of this ebb and flow of human migrations. But if you look at the numbers of us who around the room talked about our European roots, yeah, it dwarfs these numbers. Yeah. Okay, taking a cue, yeah, hands.
I was just going to mention the Argentinian case.
Yeah.
Where hundreds of thousands of people populated the Pampa.
Yeah. Absolutely. Italians, Germans, there were all kinds of people that came into Argentina, particularly after the Second World War. That's a great example, and a very recent one. Yeah.
What are the ramifications of them evacuating Calais, the jungle in France right now? So we have that huge refugee migration camp, and now they're like basically breaking it down and sending all these people into different sectors of France.
Yeah, and you probably all have followed this, but the easiest pathway, the shortest route into Britain is through Calais, across the strait, what do we call it, the English Channel, and people have been for years and years now trying to smuggle themselves across, and in this same BBC simulation on that same page, there is an animated story about a young man who hides in a molten chocolate truck by going down into the chocolate that is being transported through the channel to Britain. And you can do it on that very same page that you're all on now. But what France and Britain have been unable to do is create that orderly departure system that might help a Ghanaian or a Senegalese or an Eritrean or an Ethiopian or a Syrian make an application to come to Britain as a refugee. Britain has taken very few refugees in the last 10 or 15 years compared to the numbers that they have taken over historical time, particularly from Commonwealth nations, nations that used to be part of their empire. But right now, neither the French nor the British governments know what to do with that, but what they couldn't apparently continue to tolerate was 7,000 or 8,000 people living rough, as the British say, living outdoors in what they called the jungle, right beside the Calais exit point, because it was just a point of lawlessness and increasing numbers of people coming in, ending up there, being thwarted from getting into Britain, where many of them actually do have relatives that have gotten there earlier. It's a complicated issue for France and for Britain. Yeah.
So who is doing the best job? France and Britain are having the worst, hardest time with this.
Yeah. The consent, that's a wonderful question, and I happen to know the answer. There isn't just one answer. The best job is being done by Uganda. And one of the reasons that the Ugandans are being so successful with a very large population of refugees from countries around them is that they're not institutionalizing this idea of a camp. And that as soon as a refugee arrives in Uganda and is certified as a refugee, she gets access to school and she gets a work permit. Almost no other country in the world is doing that. And they've had so much success that the net contribution of the refugees in Uganda now is higher than the amount that the government has spent to help support them initially. And so there's some wonderful new economic data on how this might be a model for all countries to use. And it turns out that these refugees are in fact quickly becoming employers, and that they're hiring 1.7 or 2.7, I've forgotten the number, of people to work with them. And so they're like economic engines. And as somebody says in the International Organization of Migration, the people who reach your shores are the survivors. They're the strongest, the ablest, the fittest. They can leap the highest and are the strongest. They have made it. And they really could be turned into an engine for economic well-being for themselves, but also the country. So look at Uganda as a model. Now, in the interest of time, and taking the lead from the challenge of thinking individually or challenge as a family, now you're all going to become families. So Kurt, I'm going to need you to move over to your new family over here. And now you have one screen per table, and you make one set of decisions by consensus. And so pick the best screen. Did that work? And make the same journey, but do it as a family unit. Okay, let's get back together. Now, they've just landed. Okay, people, families, how was that a different experience than going through it as individuals? What are your thoughts? Yeah.
Well, as an individual, obviously I went as a female, but when we decided to get together, yeah, we were all females, and I said, yeah, but we're a family, so that means let's pick a male. And see if the
Do you think that made a difference?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. What else was different about that than going through it as an individual? Yeah.
It wasn't as hard because you didn't have to take all the responsibility for making this decision yourself.
There was strength in numbers. Well,
Yes.
Better together. No. Stronger together. No, that's right. Yeah? Kurt.
It's also like we all know committee work, it takes longer. It slows you down.
Kurt makes an important point, and he's going to make it again.
It's like we all recognize committee work. It slows you down. When you have more people putting in input, you're not as fleet. You can't make quick decisions and, yeah, okay, do this one now.
And could that have an impact on your survival?
Plus or minus.
Yeah, yeah. What?
In contradiction to that, this whole family really preferred to travel by land than sea. So that made several of our decisions easier because we chose less ocean risk.
Uh-huh.
And we actually made it to Italy. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting. And did you make that decision because you weren't seaworthy, or you couldn't swim?
The terrifying thing just seemed more terrifying in the ocean.
Yeah. On your reading list, all of the books that we put here, and the films that we've mentioned, and the organizations and the simulations are all good, but I'm reminded of swimming. There is a film on your list called Terra Firma. It's an Italian film from 2011, and a man named Emanuele Crialese is the director, and he recruited refugees to simulate those refugees who were coming, even in 2011, onto the shores of Italy. And he went to a refugee camp, and he got a whole bunch of guys to agree to be in the water and sort of scrambling to get onto boats. And he made sure by asking all of them in the interview, can you swim? And all of them said yes. And it was not true for most of them. So in the filming of the movie, it's a horrifying scene because the actors who are in the water really can't swim. And it could be that a decision like the one your family made is nobody here can swim. Yeah.
You know, it strikes me that we're presented step by step this option or this option, and there's a little context or background, but I would think that a lot of it is there's a lot of miscommunication, maybe not knowing distances or cities or rumor or maybe multiple decisions, and so it's not so clean cut as one or the other. There's a lot, and then everything you do is a decision. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you're asked to make serial decisions, sequential decisions here. You'll probably be making 6 of them at once. Do we have the life jackets? Do we take them with us? Are they going to float? Is there room for everybody in the family in this boat? And when the smuggler says the boat can take 100 people and you see that it's no bigger than your table, how can 100 people get in that boat? I mean, you're making all of those decisions just like that. And as a group, it's slower, more cumbersome, and there are so many variables. What else was different about this?
What I found was doing it alone, I never made it because we tried it 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
But with the group, I got some better information because people were reading better than I do. They saw, I was more focused and they saw other options.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Other comments, observations, feelings? Yeah.
Question. So we've seen some statistics on the drownings and how, and I think most of those where you said it was getting worse, those were all drownings, right? Or were they just deaths?
Those were all drownings because the last ones that are getting really bad are the sea route drownings. Yep.
So are there as many deaths when they're traveling by land? Are we just not hearing of that through media? Is it not tracked as much? Is it truly a safer route to travel by land right now?
It's a good question, and it leads into our segue into our break and bite of lunch. One of the things you've probably seen in the news in the last year was the European Union's decision to provide 3.5 billion euros to Turkey to get them to turn off the flow of Syrians that were passing through Turkey on the land route. And so in 2015, they feel as though about 1,100,000 refugees reached Europe. That number, because of the European Union's decision to ask Turkey with money to pay Turkey to stop the refugees, that number has gone from a little more than 1 million to about 300,000. And so that's probably a positive development in one sense, but what it meant was that the route through Turkey was what? The land route. And so one of the reasons, probably the chief reason, that the mortality rate is going up is that people are being forced back into those original routes across the Mediterranean from Libya to Lampedusa to southern Italy and across the islands of Greece and up to Europe that way. So there's been a sort of a positive development that the number of refugees has been reduced, probably because of political pressure and the inorderliness of it all. But also they have exacerbated the risks of doing that because people are going by sea. Yeah.
We hear that the numbers are largely men and of a younger age group. Is that because they physically made it, or or the others didn't initiate the process?
Yeah. She's heard that the numbers are disproportionately young men rather than whole families, and those are the ones we see, but in fact 51% of refugees are children, and then a large number of them are women, but we're not seeing as many of them, probably because most of them took the land route. Yeah, and hopefully more survival, but it was easier, and they didn't want to get on a boat with 300 people. And it's also an economic issue for a lot of families. They pick one person to try to make it, and they pick the 20-year-old man. And many of you remarked on the survival rate was higher for you when you decided to become a male. Now, we're going to take a break for lunch and talk a whole about a well-connected series of other issues this afternoon and look at some really local activities that can help support the refugee community. But before we do, I leave you with this one thing we can chew over at lunch. You have just gone through this simulation as both individuals and as families, and that's gotten you to another embarkation point. You still have a harrowing journey between you and wherever you're hoping to go. So the story isn't over, even if you've been one of those successful people to get to Southern Europe. You still have a long way to go and a lot of resistance between you and your destination. And it's particularly true of women and children who get exploited at each step along the way.